dysfunction that's existing within the termination right regime, and that artists are really struggling to actually exercise their right.
Welcome to the Washington Tech Policy Podcast.
The latest tech law and policy news and brightest tech law and policy experts wherever you are.
So you can stay informed, on the move, in less time.
From Washington, D.C., it's the Washington Tech Policy Podcast.
With Joe Miller.
Joe Miller.
Facebook and Twitter have removed hundreds of fake pro-Trump accounts tied to the Chinese religious practice Pallone-Thune, which uses a swastika as a symbol. The Senate unanimously passes robocall legislation, and Dylan Gilbert is my guest today. Hey everybody, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram removed hundreds of accounts, pages, groups, and Instagram accounts operated by individuals in Vietnam and the U.S. The accounts used artificial intelligence to evade detection and create fake profiles in order to spread misinformation. Facebook connected all of the accounts to the Epoch Times, a Chinese site operated by the Falun Gong, which has been supportive of President Trump. Twitter also removed 88,000 accounts on Friday alone, which the company tied to Saudi Arabia. Every now and then, it's nice to see some bipartisanship. The Senate last week unanimously approved robocall legislation, which will require phone carriers to block annoying robocalls free of charge. The bill also requires companies to verify that phone calls are coming from real numbers. It's called the Pallone-Thune Telephone Robocall Abuse Criminal Enforcement and Deterrence, or TRACED Act. It now heads to the president's desk for signature, which Congressman Mike Doyle expects to happen this week. Using data it collected from its user verification process, which included cross-referencing its readership against the leaked SQL database of the now-defunct violent white extremist group Iron March, Airbnb banned more than 60 of its users, mostly guests rather than renters, for their ties to Iron March. Gizmodo has the story. France has fined Google some $167 million for anti-competitive conduct. The country asserts that Google controls some 90% of the online advertising market. Earlier this year, France began collecting a 3% tax from firms that provide digital services to France-based customers. Reveal News published an article last week examining worker injuries at Amazon, where, especially during the holiday season, workers are injured bending and lifting in an effort to reach a company goal of sending out 1 million orders per hour. That translates to one item per 11 seconds for each employee. Moving at this breakneck speed, workers are increasingly injured, often keeping them out of work indefinitely. And you can find that story in Reveal News. The New York Times released a must-read report on how companies and entities we've never heard of, much less given consent to, are constantly collecting our location data, telling full stories about where we go, whom we're with, and what we're doing. It's a long read, so definitely something to check out over the holidays in the New York Times. And you can find links to all of these stories in the show notes. Stay with us.
You're plugged into the Washington Tech Policy Podcast, the inclusive voice of tech policy.
My guest today is Dylan Gilbert, Policy Counsel at Public Knowledge, where he advocates for the public interest with a focus on government affairs. His core work includes privacy, copyright reform, and a variety of telecommunications and platform-related issues. Prior to joining the Public Knowledge team, Dylan clerked at the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, the Federal Communications Commission, and America's public television stations. Dylan also has over a decade of experience working in the music industry as a performer, producer, and music supervisor. Dylan holds the JD from GW Law School and a BA from the College of William and Mary. Please welcome Dylan Gilbert. Dylan, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Joe. It's great to be on.
So you and your co-authors, Meredith Rose and Alisa Valentin, released a paper early this month on termination rights for copyright holders.
That's right.
So what is the termination right exactly? Which artists are most empowered by it? And what does it allow them to do?
Yeah, so the termination right is this small but powerful right that exists in sections 203 and 304 of copyright law. It's sort of like the Mighty Mouse of copyright protections. And so the way it works is this. Now, this isn't necessarily as prevalent as it used to be with some artists being fully independent. But generally, even to this day, a number of artists will partner with usually companies. Think of something like a record label or a book publisher. And the deal goes, the company will, distribute, promote, sometimes fund certain works of the artists. And in exchange, the artist will grant over or license over all of their copyright to those companies, which we can just call grantee. The agreement can take lots of forms because this is a contract, but oftentimes this license or grant of their copyright exists for a long time, and it can even be in perpetuity forever. So what the termination right does is it allows an artist, after a minimum of 35 years, the artist can terminate or cut short that grant of rights and fully reclaim all of the rights that they assigned over to the grantee earlier on. And that it doesn't have to be that way. The artist could, however, also use the termination right as leverage to sort of renegotiate the terms of their deal so that they could get perhaps more favorable terms. One really important aspect of this right is that it's inalienable. So a sort of fancy legal term for meaning that you can't sort of sign it away, even by contract. So, we're used to situations in our daily lives where we sort of sign away our rights. An example might be if you go scuba diving and you essentially sign a waiver saying this company is not liable for anything that happens to me, even my death. In the case of the termination right, you cannot actually sign that away. It's an inalienable right. So in that way, it's extremely powerful, and it empowers artists and creators to take control of their financial and artistic futures.
And you wrote that some artists are having trouble enforcing their termination rights. Tell us about that. What are the conflicts here?
Yeah, so unfortunately, what we're seeing through reporting, sort of court documents, and academic literature is that there's a lot of dysfunction that's existing within the termination right regime, and that artists are really struggling to actually exercise their right. So some of the things that are creating these problems are, first of all, there's very complex eligibility, timing, and sort of formalities requirements that come along with the termination right. So for example, depending on which section you use, you have to know when the effective date of the termination will be. You have to serve a notice to the Copyright Office that can only come within this very sort of specific window that's not earlier than 10 years, but not later than 2 years before the effective date. There can be a lot of complications with heirs and other sort of authorship issues. And if there are ownership disputes, sometimes that will sort of start the statute of limitations on that ownership dispute, which can make that something that you can't even deal with when you're trying to exercise your right later on. So a lot of these complexities are creating problems for artists. Secondly, we have exceptions to this right. One of them is called the work for hire exception. Generally, a work for hire, it can be pretty complicated, but it's something that an artist does sort of as an employee within the scope of their employer. So you could see maybe a traditional example of this would be if an artist is like a graphic designer, and they'll create a graphic design for a company. they never will actually own the rights to that graphic design. It's a work for hire. So the company owns those rights. And so if it is a work for hire, then you can't terminate it. And oftentimes what we're finding is a lot of these old contracts that were signed contain language saying this was a work for hire. Well, the thing is that a work for hire is actually generally a judicial determination. It's not, there are certain things like atlases or translations that are very clearly works for hire usually, but even those can be controversial. But in the case of let's say a sound recording, whether or not that actually is something that was for hire, regardless of the contract, what the contract says is something that a judge has to determine. And then similarly, you have things called the derivative works exception, which means that things like a movie adaptation is something that you can't terminate your rights to. Well, what is the and the derivative work is going to be something that is under the terms of the grant, again under the contract terms. And so what we're seeing is this incentive towards having to litigate these issues. And so that creates situations that can put a financial and time strain on artists, force them to have to use expensive legal representation. And often they're going up against extremely powerful companies. So we've got these sort of power imbalances that can create problems for artists. We think that it's possible that this could also be exacerbated by lack of representation for many artists. Many of these artists are artists of color that were subject to potentially unfair or even exploitative agreements in the past. And, we're seeing that there is corporate leadership in the entertainment industry is still overwhelmingly white and male. Only 1.8% of IP attorneys are African American. 2.5% are Hispanic or Latino, less than 0.5% Native American. So we think that there's potential that some of the lack of representation within the boardroom or at the negotiating table can further potentially exacerbate these power imbalances. And then finally, there are information asymmetries or imbalances because a lot of, to the extent that the termination right might actually be working, a lot of the agreements or settlements are under non-disclosure agreements. And so this makes it very difficult for folks like my organization or the Copyright Office to actually know what is happening, whether or not these whether or not artists are being successful, because all that we see through press reports is that they're not being successful. And so this also creates a problem with if other artists are being successful, then an artist that might be looking to exercise their termination right should be able to get a sense of what it looks like or what it might take to do so. And so there's a lot of sort of imbalances that are being created by this lack of public information as well.
So what are the solutions you're recommending here? There are 5 recommendations you made?
I think that's right. Maybe 6 really. And so one kind of common sense fix would just to make the termination right an automatic thing. It just reverts back to the artist automatically. No need to go through with all of these sort of legal formalities. And that could really help to sort of rebalance some of the, power and information asymmetries, kind of get rid of the need for going through a long and complex legal process. Of course, there would need to be an option for the artist to sort of delay in order if the artist chose to renegotiate and maybe opt out of that automatic reversion. So that would be sort of like the most simple common sense fix. It's a bit easier said than done because you would need to address joint authorship issues. We see these a lot, particularly in the context of, let's say, like a sound recording where you might have a lot of sort of cooks in the kitchen, so to speak. Also, importantly, the work for hire and derivative works exceptions would still be available under this. And if we applied this sort of retroactively, it could be potentially disruptive. So to the content industries writ large. So this could be a tricky one to implement. Another option would be to shorten the term. So right now, the minimum would be 35 years from the date of the grant. Under Section 304, it's 56 years after the copyright is obtained. So what we could do is just say that after a shorter period of time, then you can exercise your termination right. This could help to allow for a greater likelihood that the author will still be alive, to sort of get rid of, or hopefully at least minimize some disputes around heirs, and could also sort of increase the odds of there being documentary evidence. We see a need for this in sort of the book publishing world, for example, where a lot of books from the 20th century are just flat out no longer being promoted, are difficult to find, out of print, things of that nature. If there was a shorter termination period, then you could sort of alleviate the risk that all of these sort of issues could arise. A final sort of fix could be to eliminate or revise the work for hire exception, where essentially you say, look, currently, if it is a work for hire, again, you do not qualify to terminate your rights that were exchanged sort of under that. So we could say that, if a work for hire is also eligible for termination. Of course, the problem here is that it could potentially be overbroad, where we sort of, to use the example I alluded to earlier, where suddenly all of these contractors that did things that legitimately were works for hire scramble to try to capitalize on this new law and cash in on it at the expense of, sort of the legitimate arrangements. But we do think that at a minimum, maybe a good fix would be, currently artists often are using loan out corporations for tax reasons, right? So you'll create this sort of corporation, and then that corporation will do the contract on your behalf. But, if we have the opportunity for a grantee to say, no, that was a work for hire that you did on behalf of your loan out corporation, and so the grant that you made was invalid. If we could have a situation where the law was at a minimum written to say that grants through a loan out corporation are actually done by the author, then we could eliminate some of this complexity as well.
That's almost like the real estate situation where, like, people ended up not actually having a property interest in the houses they bought. You're absolutely right. Very similar kind of situation. And I know you've got 3 more solutions for us, but we're going to take a break and hear about those in just a sec. Stay with us. All right, so you were telling us about the solutions you're proposing. You mentioned revising the Copyright Act so the termination right vests automatically, and the second proposal was to make that happen much sooner. And then you recommended getting rid of the work made for hire doctrine. What else should policymakers be doing here?
Yeah, so another possibility would be to revise the statute of limitations. So right now, what we're seeing is that these joint authorship disputes that I was talking about earlier are tolling or starting the statute of limitations running, which is 3 years. And so what can happen is, if there is like sort of a joint authorship dispute that happens well before the termination right is available, then what we're seeing through certain legal disputes is that the grantee can say, well, sorry, we already had this sort of issue over whether you are the author, and the statute of limitations has already run on that. So you can't even, exercise your termination right now because you're not an author, or even if you are, that dispute was already, past the statute of limitations. And so what you could do is, and it's sort of what we're seeing is, to go back to your real estate analogy, is it's similar to adverse possession in the legal world, where, if you sort of sit on a property for long enough and the owner doesn't dispute that or know it's happening, then you can sort of adversely possess or gain ownership of that. And we want to avoid those types of situations where an author may not even know that there is some adverse claim to their ownership until they go to exercise their termination right. And then suddenly it's like, sorry, your time is up on that. And so you would want to have a situation so that joint authorship disputes under this exception wouldn't toll the statute of limitations. or at a minimum, we think that it would be good to codify the Wilson versus Dynatone holding, which basically said that registering an adverse claim at the Copyright Office doesn't toll the statute of limitations. That was a sort of artist-friendly case that came out earlier, but it only applies to one section of the copyright law. So that would also need to apply to both sections for termination right. And then a couple last ones. One quick one would be the derivative works exceptions. It would be good to sort of create sort of a rewrite or revision of the law to say that mere technical changes or improvements to a work would not qualify it to be a derivative work. So an example of this would be sort of a remaster. So you think about sort of sound recordings that get mastered back in the day, and then as technology has progressed, you'll see this often where something will get remastered using better technology to sort of give it a bigger or fuller sound. Well, if a grantee says, now, wait a second, that remaster that we did is a derivative work, then the artist can't get their rights back based on the derivative work exception. So things like mere technical improvements like remasters, we don't think are things that should qualify for the derivative works exception. Now, all of that said, you can see just sort of how complicated and wide-ranging this issue is, and it has a lot of issues with just information that isn't even publicly available. So we think that really of all of these, the best thing that can happen is for the U.S. Copyright Office to do a formal study of the termination right, to identify places where it's going wrong, places where it's going right, and hopefully to generate more public information and awareness around this powerful issue that, frankly, many artists, including myself when I was a working musician, have no idea even exists, and it's arguably the most powerful copyright protection there is. So one thing that would probably need to happen is the Copyright Office would need to implement some sort of mechanism so that entities could voluntarily submit under seal or in a redacted form some of these NDAs that have the information that were needed. But we think that this kind of a study would be very useful for identifying where things are going wrong, and hopefully can examine some of the solutions that I just went over with you to find out which ones would work, which ones might not work, and to help to improve the system for artists.
So what's happening here in Washington, Dylan, that we need to be aware of as far as copyright is concerned? Are there discussions in the works, proposed rulemakings, legislation? I know Europe revamped their copyright regime earlier this year. Do you foresee similar changes on the way here in the U.S.?
I think that some of the things we can look for on the horizon in 2020, the first thing will be the CASE Act, which is the Copyright Small Claims Court Act, which is an act that creates a copyright small claims court. This is currently under negotiation in the Senate, so potentially we could see some agreement here around what that copyright small claims court would look like, and perhaps could make it through the finish line as a final law. We're also seeing ongoing efforts to modernize the Copyright Office, so that its IT infrastructure is sort of brought up to date, and also hopefully to streamline the submission process for registering works. And you mentioned the sort of the developments in Europe. The analogy in the United States would be Section 512 of the DMCA, which provides limited liability for online service providers. And it sort of governs the copyright notice and takedown regime that a lot of folks are familiar with in the context of things like YouTube. The Copyright Office has been working on a Section 512 study for quite some time, and it looks like most lawmakers and policy wonks here in town are anticipating that study will be released this year. We can expect that concurrently with that, Congress will probably host some sort of roundtables or hearings to sort of talk about the Section 512 regime and see if see how it's working, whether there need to be any updates to it. We'll also likely see a revisitation of the Section 1201 anti-circumvention provisions. This is a situation where there could be potential exceptions to the law, which doesn't allow for people to circumvent things like DRM or digital locks. But there are certain exceptions to that for example, for folks with disabilities. Usually those exceptions are revisited every 3 years, but organizations like us think that some of those exceptions should just be baked into the law so we don't have to continually revisit this every 3 years. So we can probably anticipate looking at the triennial review in the Section 1201. And then finally, the issue of closing the terrestrial radio gap. What a lot of folks don't know, I think I didn't know this either before I went to law school, was that AM, FM terrestrial radio stations don't have to pay a license to record labels to play the songs. This is sort of a holdout from back in the day when the deal was essentially that radio stations would provide free advertising for record labels who could then get money selling records. Nowadays, people aren't really buying records anymore, right? They're streaming music. And so there's going to be a push, I think, to rewrite the law or revise the law so that that license is something that broadcasters do need to get. So I think that we'll see some energy around that issue as well.
Interesting. Well, Dylan, thanks for joining me. You know, I read the other day that Pharrell only made $2,700 in royalties from 43 million plays of Happy on Pandora, and that doesn't even include, you know, the fact that his music was played on the radio. The regime here seems to be in desperate need of reform. So thanks for illuminating those issues for us. What are some final ideas you'd like to leave with us before we close, and where can we find you online?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you again for having me. This has been great. A lot of fun. So the first thing I would say is folks should check out the paper. You can find it at publicknowledge.org/termination. Read through it, a little light reading over the holidays. And then finally, more importantly, it's really critical that folks contact their member of Congress and tell Congress to commission this study. Tell your member of Congress that we need a Copyright Office study on the termination right to help empower artists to take control of their creative futures. We actually at Public Knowledge have a phone to action. You can find that at publicknowledge.org/review the termination right. So go check that out and call up your member and let's get this situation fixed.
Dylan Gilbert, Policy Counsel at Public Knowledge. Dylan, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Joe. Have a happy holiday.
That's it, folks. I'm out of here till January 14th. Happy holidays. Happy New Year. That concludes episode 214 of the podcast. Thanks for listening. The last one of the decade. If you like what we do, we'd love to hear from you. Take a moment, head over to Apple Podcasts, give the podcast a review. It helps others know what they can expect when they check us out. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you back here next year, 2020, January 14th. See you then.
Washington.